reality exists where our minds meet matter. It's that point where mind meets matter, where you could say the light of the mind meets the light of the world. That was sort of one of the biggest breakthroughs I had. It was actually a moment. I was at school. I go to University of Central Florida, and there's this big nature area where I like to hang out. I like being outside in nature and all that. So I'm sitting at this sort of like picnic table out in this field, and there's bumblebees and hummingbirds flying around these flowers, and I'm reading this book, and it almost became like overwhelming. I had to like close the book and just sit there for like 20 minutes, no phone, just grappling with the idea that what I'm seeing isn't necessarily, to pull on this thread of light a little bit more. What I'm seeing isn't necessarily the physical matter, but I'm seeing the light reflected off that matter. And the light waves, the photons, they're entering my eyes, and my mind is conjuring up the image of what I see before me. So I really do want to pull on this thread of light a little bit more, because I think it's so fascinating, because reality is based on our perception of light as opposed to the perception of the physical atoms, the physical matter. And to quote the book, you say at one point, to understand the world, we have to realize that we are the ones who see it. So, can you speak to sort of what light is, and how it's basically, to phrase it, sort of the chief executive of the material world that meets with our minds?
Hmm. Yeah, that is profound. So this was one of the big insights of physics in the 20th century, right at the turn of the 20th century, 1900s. This series of mind blowing discoveries that we now call the quantum revolution kind of comes to just totally unsettle the previously existing Newtonian framework of science. And what's so poetic about it, and this really is, I find so much poetry in the history of science, even though it's usually just guys in laboratories like churning their way through math problems. There's just an enormous, when you step back and look at the trajectory, it's like a symphony, or the grand sweep of a poem, because it does begin with light. They're studying light, and this is something that has been causing problems for decades at this point. That, you with Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell and some of the giants of the 19th century, you eventually arrive at this realization that light is a transverse wave, an electromagnetic wave, which means that it basically is a fluctuation of energy. But in classical physics, when you think about the world, you picture a big empty box of space filled with objects. And the objects could be planets, or they could be couches, or they could be whatever, but they're moving through this empty space. And if something is a wave, right, then it has to kind of undulate through something. You think about waves moving through water, it needs a medium. There's something that is moving in a pattern, and that's what a wave is, if all there is just physical objects. And so when light starts to seem like a wave, and people are able, with Maxwell's equations, we're able to describe its motion very precisely. And the big breakthrough comes when they discover that the speed of electromagnetic waves is the same as the speed of light. And so it turns out that that's what this is. But the big question is, okay, so what's it moving through, right? What is the medium of light? What's the thing that's waving, if this is a wave? And they go through all of these different experiments to try and find it, and all these theoretical different kind of hoops that they jump through. Because if it really is a physical thing, if it's like a fluid or a gas or something, then it has to do all of these impossible things. Like, it has to be so rigid that it can host a wave that moves at this blistering speed of light, and also so thin that we can walk through it without feeling it, because it's got to be everywhere around us and all through space, right? And so this is called the ether, this idea, the luminiferous ether. And they try to find it. And finally, with the Michelson-Morley experiment and a few other key insights, it turns out, like, this is just, there is no ether. It's not a thing. And so it is Einstein's great revelation that light isn't moving through anything. It's that the world isn't actually made up of objects in a box of space. It's actually made of something much more mysterious called fields, which we sort of picture as these jellies or this kind of like undulating flow or something. But really what Einstein was getting at is that objects themselves aren't actually the bedrock of reality. Relationships are the bedrock of reality. At one point in his uh, book on relativity, he says, the only thing that's really materially real about each point in the universe is its relationship to all the other points. And so this notion that we had that we could picture the world as like, a machine made up of objects just totally melts away. Whatever the world is, it ain't that. And so then for the rest of the century, everybody is trying to figure out what is the world then? What's the world made of? And the real kind of, you know, flip over the table moment comes when Max Planck and Einstein and some of these other guys are trying to figure out, like, what exactly is light made of? What is happens to it, in a vacuum? And they come up with these results that don't make any sense if you try to picture them in Newton's world, right? So light is made up of photons, which are particles, but they have no mass, right? So they're not actually, if it's a particle, it has to have a mass. If it's matter, it has to have a mass. Things get weirder, right? These waves, these particles behave in ways that only waves can behave. But what are they moving through? And finally, with like Niels Bohr and some of these other guys, you arrive at the conclusion that unless you are observing particles of any kind, they are real, but they're not anything that the human mind can picture. In other words, the basic rudiments of existence outside of our conscious perception are totally they totally shatter every category we have: space, time, right? They don't answer to those categories, which means that we have no way of describing them except in terms of likelihoods and possibilities. We can say of a particle, when it's outside of our remit of observation, we can say it's likely to be in this or that place, but it's fundamentally impossible to say that it's anywhere until we're observing it. And so this whole notion that we have of like a world full of objects outside of us is actually kind of just a picture. It's just a mathematical idea that we use sometimes. The reality is there's a world out there, but it doesn't look like anything that we can describe until we are in relationship with it. And that's when that moment that you're having, at the table kind of starts to make sense, right? Because yeah, the bird is out there, the bees, the beautiful sunlight, all of that exists. But in order to speak of it at all, we have to speak of it as it comes through the filter of the human mind. And so human consciousness actually, in some meaningful way, creates the world, at least creates what we speak of when we speak of the world, including when we describe it with mathematical equations. And so this turns us into these indispensable receptacles for reality. It's kind of, the romantic poets are all about this. There's all sorts of, versions of this in poetry, but then it kind of comes alive in science when you realize that, in fact, like, everything that we're talking about when we are talking about objects, when we're talking about the world, is a relationship between your mind and the outside world, and it's mediated through light. It's light that allows that to happen.
That is so that is so profound. It's like, in order for the universe to exist, we have to be here to observe it. We have an integral role in the universe. But you said something really, really interesting there. I think talking about Einstein, that relationships are the bedrock of reality, not necessarily the matter itself. And I think there's actually a pragmatic lesson we can take away from that in sort of finding purpose in life. Is, you know, a lot of people say, talk about money and material gain, but that's not where fulfillment and purpose comes from. True fulfillment and purpose comes from the relationships we build while we are here on this earth. When you have kids, I don't have kids, but I'm, you know, judging by what people say when they have kids, it's like nothing you can describe. It's that relationship you're building with another human being. So I think there's sort of a pragmatic lesson we can take away from that. But earlier in your answer, you said something that I have been grappling with for a little bit now, and that's the poetry of science. You say there's poetry in science, and I think that is so true. There's a I read your book coming right off of Walter Isaacson's Leonardo da Vinci biography, who I think is probably the most fascinating person in history. But he has this quote that might be like my favorite quote of all time. I think I could just think about this endlessly. He says, "Study the science of art, study the art of science." And it's this clear connection to me between science and the material and the beauty of the abstract and the human consciousness. There is beauty and poetry in the material, in the science, but also there is sort of a technicality when you look at human consciousness and art and abstract. So I think that it all sort of comes together.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so you may know this, but the word poetry comes from a Greek word, and the Greek word is just making. It just means to make. So a poem in the original sense, in the most basic Greek sense, is anything that is made, anything that has craft in it. And when Plato talks about this in the Symposium, he says, everything is poetry. In some basic sense, everything is poetry. The bookshelf behind you is poetry. Anything that has evidence of artifice in it is poetry. But we use the word in this limited sense to describe what we do with language. But it's not because the words that we use in poetry are uniquely poetic. It's because this is sort of our most concentrated version of something that's going on everywhere, all the time that something is being made. And with language, we're able to do it in this incredibly meticulous and profound way because the words have this artistic quality to them, but they also have meaning. And so there's this wonderful union between what's being said and the way that it's being said. And once you kind of pull back from that and you realize, okay, so that's true everywhere. The crafting of a chair is a kind of poetry, right? Anything that has anytime that you take some form that's in your head and then you install it into the world somehow and you fill matter with this form, you are doing a kind of poetry. And if you think about that basic action and how we do it, in our relationships, in our daily lives, right? We begin with a vision, say, of a marriage, and then you just start to work with the raw material of each individual day, and that day is like a little piece in this picture you have in your head of what a marriage looks like. That's a kind of poetry, right? Everything is an act of poetic diction or poetic creation. And then you have to ask yourself, when you look around at the material world, at the natural world, right? Is there poetry there? In other words, are we confronted with a bunch of unformed raw material? Or are we looking at the results of a mind with an idea in its head that is working these things out, right? And this is why, in the Bible, when Paul says you are God's handiwork, this is the typical English translation is you are God's handiwork. The Greek is you are God's poema. You are God's poetic action. You yourself are a poem. And this conversation that we're having right now, right? That yeah, in my own little room alone, I suppose there's somebody called Spencer. That is, I have my thoughts and my character. I'm not a totally malleable person. But, I wrote that book. It drew something out of you that wasn't, it's not just the book. It's where you were in your life at that moment, and it's what was going on around you that you happened to be happening when and that network of relationship produced something in you that then inspired you to sort of reach out to me. And now here we are having this conversation, which is also part of the poetry of our lives, right? And either that is just like a thing that is going on sort of randomly, or there is an author of this poem, and we are not it. Like there's actually, when you look back on your life, you realize that you are a kind of poetic act on God's part. Like you are this idea that he has, that he's gradually working out, including, bearing in mind that you're going to make mistakes and knowing that you're going to get confused. Like that's part of his poetic design. And once you see that, it's actually like, life itself becomes incredibly profound.
And it becomes self-evident. It's like once you see that, you can't unsee it. It seems so self-evident. But yeah, I mean, we are the poets of our lives. Like, there's this book, I think maybe James Smith, I forget the author's name, but it's called As a Man Thinketh. And he's basically like, your thoughts become your reality, your circumstances, and you are the creator of your life. Whatever you want your life to be is at the manifestation of your thoughts. But I mean, it's so true. To me, there really is poetry in everything. Like this cup of coffee here, like this is beautiful to me. Like there is poetry in even the mundane and everything. And boiling that down to the most macro is God is the poet of the universe. The universe is his creation. And I mean, going back to light, looking at Genesis, like it seems that it's so significant. Like it became so obvious to me why God created light first, let there be light. Because everything after that seems irrelevant or, out of reach without the creation of light. Light is, as I said before, the chief executive of the universe. So I mean, what is the significance of God creating light first?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that Genesis is not alone in assigning special significance to light. So there are all sorts of mythologies where light is very important. But one important thing to understand about the book of Genesis is that when it was composed, there were a lot of rival mythologies out there. It was not like something that got dropped into the world. It's not Genesis, not the first creation story that anyone's ever told. And if you look at the other creation stories that were current in the ancient world, you get, for instance, the Enuma Elish of the Near Eastern civilizations that were kind of in the realm where Abraham would have been. Or you get Hesiod's story of the creation of the world in the Theogony. And as you start to study these different creation myths, you realize that Genesis is not just unique, it's purposefully, self consciously unique. And one of the ways that it is unique, I would almost think of it as like a kind of revisionist history, is that every other kind of myth that we have begins with formlessness and chaos, um, begins with, Apsu and Tiamat, these two water gods, kind of tangling together in this nameless void, and then from that, all of these forms start to generate. And similarly, in Hesiod, you have chaos, which is this big chasm, and then you have ocean, and you have love, this kind of erotic desire that drives things together, and then there's kind of a bunch of different things that come out of that, like the Titans and all these different entities, and then some king god like Zeus or Ashur or Marduk has to get up, fight a big fight, and impose order upon the chaos. So you start with chaos, and then you have somebody through force imposing order. And usually that's where the light comes in. It's usually the king god that speaks light into the world. Now, you take that background and understand the Genesis is designed to stand out against that background. And you think, in the beginning, God, those already, the first three words or four words or whatever in English, are already a radical reversal of every other creation myth ever. Because in the beginning, God says, no, there wasn't chaos first. There was a perfect mind first, one design for creation. And he created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. And there is therefore this kind of formlessness, right, that God creates in order to work with it. He makes his own raw material. He doesn't find the raw material as part of the background of the universe. He actually speaks that, or produces that rather. And then, looking upon the tohu vabohu, the formless and void, he says, let there be light. Vayahi or, let there be light. And so it's in that moment, right, that God has basically taken raw potential. Like it's really unclear what exactly that is, because we couldn't even conceive of it. It has no, whatever tangible anything, and he makes it visible. So as you say, it is the chief executor of the universe because it is the first thing that it makes it possible for this potential to become reality. And if you take that prime idea and you just poured it over for a second into the quantum physics that we were talking about, right? The When you start to ask yourself a question like, what is a particle? What is an electron? Let's say when we're not looking at it, if it's just in a void and we're not looking at it, is it here or there? How fast is it moving? How fast is it spinning? All that stuff, right? The answer to most of those questions is it's just potential. It's just possibility. It could be any range of ways. But then only when light strikes an object and we are able to observe it, or the object itself makes some sort of impression that we're able to observe, then the tohu vabohu, the formlessness and the void, comes into existence. So this kind of foundational act of creation that stands at the fountainhead of all existence is happening again and again every time a human consciousness opens its eyes upon the world. And I mean, do I think that the author of Genesis got a preview from God of the Schrodinger equations? No, I do not. I don't think that. I think instead that when in Genesis, what you're getting is a template for the order of the universe that is radically different from every other template in exactly this way. That it says the first thing that happened, or the prime thing that exists, is a mind, and then the mind is able to give form to the formlessness that it creates. I mean, that is like, you know, completely different, not only from everything that went before it, but from all the other alternatives that still exist today, right? It is still the only version of that story that actually makes any sense and that would lead us to expect the universe to make sense, which is a key paradigm of science as well.
I'm a political philosophy junkie, so it's almost sort of what Thomas Hobbes was arguing in Leviathan, is that the state of nature is chaotic and you need a, in his case he was arguing for the monarchy, but you need that force to instill order upon the chaos. I think he missed the mark a little bit with monarchy, but if he was making sort of a religious argument or an argument for creation, I think he would have hit the mark in that the state of nature is chaotic and you need that creator to instill order on the universe.